Hey everyone, this is a video on section 2.4, critique of the maximizing behavior of consumers and producers. I think that is the biggest mouthful of one we have. Here we're going to look at the assumptions of rational economic decision making, and then we're going to question those assumptions and critique how true are they. So we are going to look at the assumption that firms act rationally in order to maximize profit, and the idea that consumers will make rational choices in order to maximize their own utility or their satisfaction. These are assumptions we've essentially made throughout the course so far, but now it's time to ponder whether they're actually true. So that acting rationally, by that we really mean that individuals act in their own self-interest. So firstly, we'll look at consumers and consumer rationality. Firstly, what we'll look at is irrationality here. So let's look at this little scenario. The waiter comes up to a diner and says, there are two options, the pulled pork sandwich and the chicken sandwich. The customer says, well, I'll have the chicken. A minute later, the waiter returns. The kitchen is also advised that today there is a tuna sandwich. The customer responds to that, in that case, I'll have the pork. Now, this is clearly irrational. Before, they preferred the chicken to the pork. Now, after this irrelevant third option has arrived, they've now claimed that they prefer the pork to the chicken. That's clearly irrational and doesn't make sense. So we're going to explore the limits of consumer rationality a little bit more now. Firstly, we make some assumptions. We have made assumptions about consumer rationality, and we'll just outline these. So we assume that they have consistent preferences. So if there are two goods, the consumer knows that they prefer A to B or B to A, or that they're indifferent between the two. That's a transitivity assumption. And it has to also follow their consistent preferences that if there are three, A, B, and C, if they prefer A to B and B to C, then they must also prefer A to C. If that doesn't happen, then they are also being irrational. The consumer prefers more of a good to less of a good. Consumer will always benefit from more consumption. This is the idea that consumers are non-satiated. You know, that assumption we make of unlimited wants, right? And finally, we assume that consumers have perfect information. So this is information about, or every bit of information you can have about goods. So the different qualities, the relative qualities of different goods, and also the prices. Where can they get the absolute cheapest one? If they're acting rationally, they will go for two identical products. They will always buy the cheapest one. But of course, in reality, that's not quite so true. We also assume that they will act with this perfect information to maximize their utility. Okay, now we'll look at some limitations of these because we know that they're not fully correct. So firstly, bounded rationality. That we're rational, I say we because we're all consumers, that we're rational but only within bounds. There are reasons why we can't. Insufficient information, ability to obtain information, and the ability to process the information. So sometimes consumers will seek to satisfy. So we'll come back to this word later, which means obtain a satisfactory outcome rather than an optimal outcome. So look at this picture here. This guy's buying jeans. It is hard to fully buy the best possible jeans for you. There's too much choice. He's just in one store, and he's probably got 15, 20 different types of jeans he could buy. So we can't process all that information. We can't make the optimal choice. So what we tend to do is we make a choice that's good enough. It's satisfactory. Limitations of, well, the bounded self-control is that we can only exercise self-control within limits. So we can't always be rational. Sometimes we eat too much, save too little, work too little, even though it is irrational to do so. I'm not going to show this video now, but I find this to be a fascinating example of it. How, one of the best basketballers of all time was arguably irrational in some of his behaviors. Now, I said we'll watch it another time in class. Bounded selfishness is the idea that we sort of have assumed that consumers are selfish, that they'll act in their own self-interest, but rational theory can't really explain the selflessness of people. So, for example, people giving to the homeless, giving to charity, that is selfless. That will reduce their own personal welfare.